Long before anyone could hear her, she was shouting into the empty heat. Under the sun, her voice broke like a desert. Itself desired to absorb the noise. With one leg pulled high by a painful rope, Maggie Doyle hung twisted on that wooden frame in the middle of the Lincoln Plains. Her flesh was scratched raw by splinters and dust, and her clothes was torn. With her hand bound, she continued to try to pull her dress down, but each breath just increased her shame. The discomfort wasn't the worst part. It was the worry that all that would be seen of her would be a broken body abandoned to the vultures. Even though she knew the desert had no mercy, she whispered for assistance. With the belief that the heat would force her to confess before midnight, Prescott's men had tied her up and rode off laughing. However, there was nothing to confess, only a truth that, if no one heard it, she feared would pass away with her. At last, a shadow appeared on the horizon. Dust rose behind the hooves of a careful and slow-moving rider. She hoped it wasn't one of Prescott's guys coming back to complete the task they had begun. She saw a set of weary blue eyes beneath the brim of a tattered cowboy hat when he came to a stop next to her. At the tee first, Jacob Hale remained silent. When he saw her floating in the blazing wind, all he could do was gaze in disbelief. Then, without warning, his eyes lowered. His gaze landed on the location she desired to be concealed more than anything on earth. She felt a burning of humiliation shoot through her. Her voice tore from her throat. Avoid looking there. Jacob's cheeks was burning with remorse as he yanked his head away, but he was unable to take away what he had witnessed. He was unable to pretend that the marks on her flesh weren't the product of a monster. The only question that remained in her mind at this point was straightforward and horrifying. Like the others, would this man ride off and abandon her to perish? Or would he risk all and accomplish the unimaginable to save a woman he was never supposed to see? Jacob stayed put, not after hearing the tremble in her voice. No one should ever carry on their flesh after witnessing the charred mark and the bruises on her legs. He tried to control his breathing as he stood in the sweltering wind, contemplating the kind of man he would become today. Rather, Jacob moved in closer. Be cautious and slow. Maggie attempted to turn away from him, but she was restrained by the ropes. She instinctively squeezed her legs together while speaking once more, even more softly this time. Don't look there, Jacob firmly swallowed. To demonstrate that he posed no threat, he raised both hands slightly. I'm not here to gaze, ma'am. You appear to be dying, which is why I'm here. Maggie could feel the remorse in his soft yet harsh voice. When it came to playing the hero, most guys were dishonest. However, Jacob didn't act dishonestly. He moved as if he had seen too much and didn't want to burden himself with any more ghosts. He checked the knots as he went around the wooden frame. The knots were designed to cut into skin, so when his fingertips touched the rope, he muttered a faint, unhappy word. Prescott fashion. All right, he mumbled. When Maggie heard that name, she winced. Jacob said softly and leaned close. He intended to shatter more than just your bones if he did this to you. Maggie shut her eyes. A tear trickled down her cheek. She jerked once again as Jacob carefully stroked her ankle to check circulation. Simple. I'm just checking to see whether you can feel your foot. She said, I can feel all of it. He looked up at her and said, and I cowboy love stories wish I couldn't. For the first time, they looked at each other fearlessly. He learned everything he needed to know from that one glance. She wasn't at fault. She wasn't wicked. Prescott had said nothing about her. She was a lady attempting to survive in a society that preferred to break the weakest people first. After inhaling, Jacob made a decision that I'm getting you down. All right. Then the sound that altered everything appeared. Hoofbeats, Prescott's men, two riders coming back quickly. And Maggie was struck by a cold, straightforward query. Now that danger was directly in front of him, would Jacob fight to save her, or would he leave her in order to protect himself? When Jacob heard those hoofbeats, all of his old instincts sprang to life. He was no longer able to think. People were slain by thinking. Maggie could feel the heat from his chest against her side as he moved in close to her. He whispered, "Hold on," before she could ask what. He displayed his knife. At her wrist, the rope broke away. The blood started to flow again, and pain shot back in her arms. More out of stubborn pride than power, she gulped down a tear. As she sagged, Jacob grabbed her by the waist and severed the rope on her lifted leg. Her ripped dress fell once more for a brief while, and she whispered, "Don't look there." He didn't. He took off his own coat and wrapped tails from the west. With swift, forceful hands, she wrapped it around her hips. In a cloud of dust, two horses slid to a halt. When he saw Maggie on the ground, the first of Prescott's men, a thin man with poor teeth, smiled. "Leave her till sundown," the boss commanded. What are you doing?" "Hail." Jacob stood up straight, doing his best to keep Maggie behind him. However, he spoke steadily. "I'm changing the schedule." The second man spat. His eyes had that sleepy, inebriated glow, and he smelt like cheap whiskey. "I've heard that you formerly wore a uniform. I assumed you were capable of obeying commands." Jacob gave a sardonic smile. "I quit for that reason." With his hand on his gun, the scrawny one leaped from his saddle. "Move away from the girl." Jacob was the first to move, but he was no longer as quick as a young buck. With a dull crack, his fist struck the man's jaw, causing pain to shoot up his own arm. Old West tales weren't cleaned up by the man that he stumbled and wildly swung back, striking Jacob across the nose with his knuckles. Jacob's nostril suddenly began to bleed. The second reached for his handgun. Jacob reached for his wrist, but it wasn't as fast as it once been. Jacob's ribs, where an old war scar used to hurt when the weather changed, were struck hard by the other man's elbow. His knees dropped and a white ache flared in his side. The man's gun fell from his grasp and struck the ground close to Maggie's feet. On sheer terror and something that like obstinate pride, she grabbed it with both hands. Despite never having fired a pistol before, she aimed it at the sky and pulled the trigger. Like thunder, the shot blasted through the deserted countryside. Both men's hands flew from their belts as they froze and shuddered. "You want to try that again?" Her voice was tremulous but loud as she yelled. "Next time I might not miss." Whatever bravery the whiskey had given them drained out of their boots as they glanced from Jacob's bloody face to the woman with crazy eyes and a smoking rifle. Cursing and clutching their wounded jaws, they retreated in the direction of their horses before riding away in a cloud of shame and dust. He cleaned his nose of the blood. A dark trail of tobacco juice was spat onto the dust by him. "Can you sit a horse?" "I will fall off," she said. "I will catch you," he declared. With a grunt that seemed to originate from his boots, he pulled her into the saddle. Then he swung up behind her, grasping the reins with one arm, while firmly encircling her to prevent her from slipping. In the direction of the far-off line of the Capotan Hills, the horse leaped past the moaning men. Maggie struggled to breathe when the prairie breeze struck her face, but everything continued to tilt sideways. Her head dropped back on Jacob's shoulder as her fingers relaxed in the horse's mane that he whispered, "Stay with me," but she was already rolling her eyes. The steady pounding of his heart against her back was the last thing she experienced from a Wild West love story. The world fell dark once more after that. To ensure you don't miss the next voyage, please hit like and subscribe if this tale touched you. Get your tea or coffee. Your story counts too. So keep listening to these Old West hearts and let me know in the comments what time it is where you are and where you're listening. Maggie had stopped fighting the saddle by the time the distant Capotan Hills came up like a line of weary giants. Her weight slumped against Jacob's chest. Her breath was ragged and shallow, and she was out cold. With each breath, an ancient scar from a field known as Shiloh throbbed along his ribcage. However, he disregarded it in the same manner that he disregarded the majority of his own suffering. He led the horse off the main path and into a small deer path that meandered over bush and boulders. At last, they came to a halt behind a stone ledge in a shallow draw above the Rio Bonito. Her fever broke out that evening. She mumbled half-words about brands, numbers, and a man's boots on her throat while she alternately shivered and burned. After soaking a bandana in the chilly creek, Jacob applied it slowly in circles on her face, neck, and unmarked areas of her thigh until his own fingers became numb. He supported her while gradually pouring water between her lips. "Don't look there," she said in a faltering whisper as her hand feebly tugged at his shirt. He took a deep breath. "I'm not," he replied. "I'm just keeping you here." Her breathing had calmed down by the second morning, and the wild gleam in her eyes had turned to a weary clear. She detested the weakness in her legs, but she also sensed his unwavering power. He moved in a way that wasn't at all burdensome, much like carrying her. He placed her on a blanket and immediately moved aside to allow her to tighten his coat around herself. He said, "I'm going to look at that leg." Maggie winced. "Not there." His gaze locked with hers. "For you, not for me." He knelt beside her and worked at the ripped cloth, his eyes fixed on her face. He only lowered his gaze long enough to observe the damage when she nodded slightly. The area surrounding the brand had inflamed, irritated skin that was encircled with unsightly purple bruises. Where the rope had rubbed her raw, there was crusted blood. He exhaled slowly through his teeth. "That man should be in chains," Jacob mumbled. Maggie replied, "That man owns half the cattle in Lincoln. The law also has dinner at his table." She saw the tightening of his jaw. "Is it the reason he treated you this way?" Her chuckle sounded weak and bitter because you saw too much. "I seen his workers severing skins from other brands. On the drive, I noticed more animals than any neighbor had reported missing. The figures didn't add up," I informed him. He claimed that the issue was with my eyes. She took a swallow. As the sky turned gold, they sat there. Two individuals who were virtually strangers that morning are now united by a secret inscribed on her skin. Maggie uttered the question that had been bothering her ever since he cut her down as she gazed at the waning light. "What will you do, Jacob, if Prescott comes looking for you because of me? Run or ride back into that town and expose his transgressions to the public?" Jacob took a while to respond. He simply observed the sky changing from gold to orange as though it were thinking with him. "I wore a blue coat and did what I was told when I was young," he eventually said. "I witnessed men suffer because I chose to ignore them. I made a self-promise to God that I would never do that again. However," he continued, "we are not riding in a Lincoln tomorrow. Not with me breathing like an old mule and you hardly standing at all. Rather, he led her to a rusty little ranch in the adjacent valley owned by Cal Turner, a former federal soldier who owed Jacob his life from a region in the east where the gunfire seemed to never end. Cal's expression became icy as soon as he saw Maggie's injuries and the brand on her leg. By the following evening, for more men, all gray at the temples, were gathered around Cal's kitchen table. They all had fresh grievances against cattle barons who believed they owned the entire region in addition to old wounds, and no one spoke until the cups were empty after Cal poured coffee thick enough to float a horseshoe. They were worn-out men who had witnessed far too many bullies remain wealthy and unpunished. Jacob's name, Cal's, and the names of two individuals who had witnessed Prescott's group running stolen livestock through the canyon were included in a telegram that was sent up to Fort Stanton. In order to recruit a photographer who could carry his camera on a wool guy and bring him peace to the ranch, Cal's nephew rode to Lincoln. Maggie relaxed and allowed them to snap a photo of the bruises and the brand. Evidence that was more powerful than her voice could ever be that a few days later, Cal and the other elderly soldiers trailed closely behind Jacob and Maggie as they rode back into Lincoln. Red-faced and confident, Prescott emerged from his office. He claimed that Jacob was an idiot, a lawbreaker, and a guy who had been blinded by a wicked lady. Maggie did the most difficult thing she had ever done at that point. Her speech remained steady despite her hand trembling. "You told him not to look at me," she added as she emerged in front of the town preacher, wives, and ranch workers. "You warned them all not to look since they would see who you are if they did." She displayed the mark that Prescott had burned into her skin while Jacob was by her side. Evidence that the man they dreaded had never been afraid to destroy a lady in order to keep his stolen animals safe. Cal's telegram prompted a Fort Stanton officer to ride in and ask his own inquiries. Prescott was no longer the hunter by the conclusion of that week. "You know," she murmured, "I would have perished believing that I was nothing more than that mark if you had gone away on the first day." Jacob gave a headshake. "Maggie, you're not the brand. The iron is in your hand. Now, this is not a tale about livestock or bullets. It is about a question that every man will eventually have to answer. Do you turn away when they tell you not to look? Or do you confront the reality head-on and maintain your position? To ensure you don't miss the next voyage, please tap like and subscribe if this tale touched you. Get your tea or coffee. Continue to pay attention to these traditional Western hearts. Additionally, let me know in the comments what time it is, where you are, and how you're listening. Because your narrative is important,